Hello everyone. In this update, I address a lot of issues with fighting AI and player UX. The first thing you might notice is there's now HUD elements. The player can see their health and energy. There's also a game objective tracking at the top. Previously, the dogfights were, well, really hard. The player could not really create any space between themselves and the AI. To help solve this, I created an AI debugger tool, which lets me spawn and destroy ships. To help visualize, you can set it to always view relative to a plane between the two ships. This will occasionally flicker when ships get too close, but it lets you see the behaviors from a fixed perspective relative to the ships. You can also make the background gray to easily see the ships. To handle these AI issues, I decided to make special cases for when an AI is fighting a player. We can use this checkbox to have the AI pretend to be a player, which engages the special cases, and we can view them from a distance using this tool. One issue I noticed is that the AI rapidly turns around when passing the player. The player doesn't really have a lot of time to turn around, so I added some resistance to the ship turning based on how far away it is from the player. This turned out to be too slow, so I gamified it a bit and added a boost for the AI when they're passing the player to create more distance. Well, this worked, but it made the AI too easy. After thinking on this for a while, I came up with an idea. Before it was too hard, and now it is too easy. What if I blended between the two modes to find the right difficulty? Rather than settling on a specific blend between the two behaviors, I created some variability. Sometimes the ship was coming at you at full force, like it was before I made any changes. Other times it's going at the player with the maximum slowdown, so it's really easy. I have it cycling between these two using a cycling sigmoid curve, which is driving basically how much difficulty we apply. Personally, I think this feels like it breathes life into the AI, making it much less static and more kind of dynamic, like a real player. I suspect that one could add multiple curves over different time cycles and create a very fluid AI experience, but I haven't taken it that far yet. Anyways, the dogfights are much more enjoyable now, but I'll probably have to continue to tweak them as I develop the game. Another issue is that there were cases where the player wasn't seeing a lot of action from enemy fighters, so I created a system that would occasionally attempt to force an AI to target a player. This only happens if no one is attacking the player, and it only happens every now and then. But it did resolve those cases where the player could be free from attackers, if all the attackers were tied up fighting other ships. Yet another issue was with the objectives. While they were functioning, they didn't currently have a targeting system. So I created a system to assign targets for the objectives. But querying into the spatial hash is really expensive, and I've yet to optimize that. Also, these turrets need to find a target over a large distance, which would require querying into many spatial hash cells. So how to avoid doing those queries? I created an amortized system where during each frame, we only attempt to assign 4 targets to the turrets/satellites. We're already doing a walk over all the ships, so part of that walk, I just do a quick test. Is this ship a good candidate for targeting? If so, target them. This way we don't turn our ship walk into an order n plus m, where n is the ships and m is the objectives needing targets. It stays order n plus 4, which is just big O of n. I also created some obvious features, like if the turret is getting shot and its current target is far away, it'll switch targets to defend itself. So now the turrets and satellites target ships, but the ships don't target the objectives. I created another system where the team will assign ships from a carrier to attack another carrier. This is a balancing act. If one carrier is taking a lot of damage, it will assign more of its fighters to attack another carrier. I modified the ship behavior tree to have a new state for attacking objectives. The ship will set up a bomb run and then attack the objective. This is necessary because the AI ships are still trying to avoid flying into the carrier ships. So putting them at some distance and then having them fly at the ship prevents them from being influenced by the avoidance spheres. After some testing, I noticed it was kind of easy for the player to destroy a lot of objectives and remain unchallenged. So I created another system. If the carrier ship detects that someone destroyed an objective, then it will spawn a ship and have that ship target the thing that destroyed its objective. This made it much harder for the player to go on a rampage without repercussions. To make AI ships a bit better player killers, I temporarily dampened the AI sphere avoidance while they target a player, but they still have the same AI ship avoidance when targeting other AI ships. So in an attempt to get the game closer to a finished state, I removed all the debug lines, but I noticed having a line indicator where your attacker is relative to your ship is really useful and actually makes the game a lot funner. So I made this part of the player's pilot UI system. It also can be somewhat hard to see your attacker, so I created a stencil buffer based highlight. The way this works is, I detect who is targeting player in each render update. I render these ships very early, also having it write a bit to the stencil buffer. Then I disable writing to the stencil buffer and render everything like normal. And lastly, I use a special highlight shader, which renders the model again, but it slides the vertices out a bit based off the normal. So it uses the normal to slide the vertices out. This is like scaling up the ship, but it respects the weird angles of the ship. So I use the shader to render the ship again, but only using a specific color. I make sure that this render will not overwrite places where the stencil buffer has been marked, and also it won't write where it fails to test. So this doesn't overwrite the ship that we drew because of the stencil buffer, but it also can be masked by like other ships and carriers, that kind of thing. And that's it for this update. I'm thinking I will explore adding audio stubs in the next update. Thanks, like, and subscribe.